And so tonight, you're going to have a story. Now, while you are listening to the story, you're going to want to ask questions. I want you to ask those questions. You'll see in your Zoom, there is a chat. And that chat is very important. Any question you put there, I am going to make sure, I'm going to be watching that chat very, very closely. And I want you to put all your questions there, and I will make sure that every single one of them is answered right after the story. So we're going to have about an hour of the story, and then we're going to have about an hour of the question and answer period, of which during that time, of course, you're going to be able to unmute yourself and ask your own questions as well. And so with that, I'm going to take this opportunity to welcome Rabbi Shlomo Litvin. Rabbi Shlomo Litvin is known as the Bluegrass Rabbi. He is the Chabad Rabbi in Kentucky. But besides for being someone who knows the finest and the best bourbon in the world, which for some of us is très important, but besides for that, Rabbi Litvin is also a renowned historian, and he spent years researching and uncovering elements of the story of Esther that have not been heard before. And we're very happy to have him with us tonight. So we'd like to ask Rabbi Litvin to unmute and say l'chaim with us. Tell us what his favorite bourbon is, because that's also important. And please share with us the story of Esther the way we've never heard it before.
L'chaim, l'chaim.
What are you drinking there?
So it's infused, what we call a Kentucky tea. A tea infused with my favorite bourbon, which is Bourbon Rabbi's Barrel Pick Reserve, a special pick. There's a rabbi who has the ultimate spiritual taste in bourbon. If you want bourbon to uplift you, you can go to bourbonrabbi.org. If you want to get Rabbi Bernath, the perfect gift for anything besides Passover, bourbonrabbi.org. That's another one of the Chabad rabbis in Kentucky who does that. And that's my favorite bourbon when I can afford it. But I thought for this special night, I'm going to splurge on myself and have an extra special l'chaim. So for anyone who's ever been a fan of a literary hero or a movie figure, anytime you want to have a series, you have to start off with an origin story. But oddly, there is no origin story in the Megillah. The Megillah starts off, the Jews were all living in Persia. All the kids in the room raised their hand. They said, "One second, Rabbi, the last book we were reading, the Jews were living in Israel. What happened?" You seem to have skipped a couple steps. There was a Babylonian guy coming. There was, who's Persia? Where's Persia? Who are these people? First of all, who can believe such a story? Okay. Someone asked me, is there any practical lessons today from the Purim story? I said, no, it's one of those unbelievable stories. Here's what's happening. The king of Iran wants to kill all the Jews. I know it sounds crazy. Who could think of such a thing? But anyways, so before we can discuss the Purim story, we're going to do a little bit of background. We're going to start a little bit in the past, backtrack a couple of years, and then we'll better understand the story. So in the Jewish year, excuse me, in the Jewish year 3319, so in the Jewish year 3319, the king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar, conquers the country of Judea, of Yehuda. Yehuda, until this point, was being ruled by a grandchild, descendant of King David. The temple was running like normal. Not all the Jews were as connected as they should have been, but the Jews were dwelling securely in their land. Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers the country. The king becomes a vassal. While he's still ruling, he has to pay homage, he has to pay complete control to Nebuchadnezzar, but the Jews are able to continue. And then suddenly, an awe-inspiring moment happens. Yirmiyahu gets up, and although he's been a prophet for many years, he gives a phenomenal prophecy. He says this foreign king is going to destroy the temple. He's going to destroy the temple For 70 years, we're going to be in exile, and then we're going to return to the land of Israel. As you can imagine, the Jewish king at that time was furious. How could someone say that my efforts to save the kingdom, that my efforts to save the temple aren't going to work? And he was imprisoned for it. He was harassed for it. And then in 3327, this is all happening roughly 400 years before the Common Era, King Yechaniah, the descendant of David, is removed from Israel, is exiled together with his entire court, all of his sons, the rabbis of the grand court, the Sanhedrin, and all the leaders of the tribes and all the leaders of the major families in the country are all taken to Babylonia. If that wasn't enough, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar on Tisha B'Av in the year 3338, the Holy Temple was destroyed. This is still marked, of course, by Tisha B'Av, by the fast day we have every year. So in the span, if you see here, the span of basically 20 years, Nebuchadnezzar entered the country and eventually destroyed the temple. At this point, there were still a couple Jews living in the land of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar put in a governor named Gedaliah. For those of you who are familiar with all the Jewish fast days, you know who Gedaliah is already. Gedaliah was an incredibly trusting leader. He fully believed the Jewish people were a holy people who would never stoop to political assassinations. So he refused to allow his men to search people who were coming to pray on Rosh Hashanah. That plan didn't work out for him, and he was sadly killed on Rosh Hashanah. Till this day, the day after Rosh Hashanah, the third day of Tishrei, we fast to remember Gedaliah. And after that, some of the Jews fled to Egypt, which was then conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. And after that, the vast majority of Jews were now living in Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar had some major issues with Judaism. He didn't understand this belief system that differed from his. He was not only an idol worshiper, but he himself was one of the prime idols. He believed himself to be a king. However, he did admire some of the young men that came from the land of Israel to his court. Particularly, there were 4 young men: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel rose to prominence when the king had a dream no one can interpret. One night, the king had a dream of a figure that he knew was himself, but didn't resemble him. The figure was a giant with a head of gold and a body made up of brass and silver and clay and iron, and it was walking, controlling everything it saw. And then it stepped on a small stone, which grew incredibly and knocked the body over. Nebuchadnezzar was horrified. He clearly knew this was him that had fallen in the dream, and he wasn't sure how to react. And he asked his advisors to tell over the dream. None of them could. And finally, Daniel came. Daniel said that the golden head represented ruling, and the body made of 4 parts represents 4 empires that will threaten the entire world. Your empire of Babylon, the Persian Empire, the Mohammedan Empire, and the Roman Empire, which still exists today. And although it seems the Jews are just a little pebble that they're stepping on, eventually the Jews will exist and they will not. After that, Nebuchadnezzar recognized the wisdom of Daniel and gave him a place in his court. He made him an advisor, and he allowed him to free some of the young men that were imprisoned as leaders of the Jews and bring them to the court with him. Nebuchadnezzar passed away in the year 3364, 26 years after destroying the temple. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was incredibly invested in his power. He thought of himself as the greatest king of all time and wanted everyone else to think the same. And how does a king measure himself? With wealth. He was the wealthiest king in history. He had conquered the majority of the known world. However, he realized that people pay me taxes. And after I die, my wealth is going to go up. If there's one thing that I'm not an economist, but if there's one thing I know about the economy is the rich always get richer. So he said, there's a problem. If the rich always get richer, I'm going to pass all my money to my son. And then in the history books, they're going to say, Evel Madrach, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, the richest king of all time. He's going to take my place in the history books. I don't think the Guinness book existed yet, but Nebuchadnezzar was already vying for his place on the cover. So he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'll take 2 giant boats. I'll fill them with gold and I'll sink them. That way, my son's net worth will be the opposite of mine. Apparently, the Babylonian dream was for your children to be a little bit poorer than you are, the opposite of the American dream. And so his son, Evil Madrach, it's interesting, the way it's spelled in English, Evil, would make you think he was the worst king. He actually, compared to his dad and his son, was pretty good. He allowed the king of the Jews to be freed from prison, and he allowed Jewish life to grow in Babylon, although he did not allow the Jews to return to the land of Israel. Now, the most important thing in world history and in Jewish history that happened during Evil Madrach's time didn't happen. It happened to the east. There was a family that abandoned their son in the wilderness as a child. His legend was he was raised by dogs. In fact, his very name means raised by dogs. He named himself Koresh. And he became a wild man and abandoned. He was known for his love of adventure, his love of war. And eventually, all the thieves and bandits of the country named him their leader. The king of the neighboring country of Media was named Daryavish, or Darius. And he was concerned about this Persian warlord. So he said, I'll make you a deal. How about you marry my daughter? Excuse me. You marry my daughter. You become my son-in-law. I'll make you the general of my army. I'll give you all the Persian armies at your disposal. And you'll be king once I'm gone. And that way, instead of you weakening my country, you'll strengthen my country. L'chaim, l'chaim. And Koresh said that's a hard deal to turn down. However, he said, I'll only do it if I can take the army and immediately start fighting other countries. I'm not looking for the cushy royal life. I like ruling from a place of war. I'm a warrior. That's what I want to do. And Daryavish said, of course, why wouldn't I want more land? Anything you conquer, you're now conquering in my name. By all means, conquer your heart away. In 3387, Evil Madrach passes away, and his son Belshazzar becomes king of Babylonia. Belshazzar was not like his father. He had no passion in his heart for the Jews. When he thought of the Jews, all he thought of was this dream of his grandfathers that he grew up hearing about how one day the Jews are going to topple his kingdom. He was obsessed with it and terrified by it, and he oppressed the Jews very heavily. In the 3rd year of his reign, however, his advisors came to him with a brilliant piece of information. They said, as you know, your father conquered the land of the Jews, and the greatest of the Jewish prophets at that time. So in 3319, your father conquered the Jews, your grandfather. And at that time, the Jewish prophet said that for 70 years, there'll be punishment, there'll be exile, and then they'll return to Israel. But it's already been 70 years, and they haven't returned to Israel yet. What this means is the God of the Jews no longer has any power. This is a wonderful celebration. This is a day of great blessing. So it's been 70 years. The threat of the Jews is no longer present, and your kingdom will dwell forever. And Belshazzar said, that sounds very convincing. I'm in. So Belshazzar threw a great party. Until then, he had shown some reverence for the God of the Jews. He hadn't tried to offend God in any way, but that was totally lost now. He was 100% ready to offend God however possible. He threw an enormous banquet. He dressed in the clothes of the high priest in an incredibly offensive manner. He used utensils and decorations from the temple, and he invited all the officers of the land to celebrate with him the downfall of the Jews. He was so overwhelmed, he even invited the Jewish leaders. Daniel, who had been the advisor of his father and grandfather, was also invited to the party. And they ate and drank long into the night. And then, as it became close to midnight, suddenly a hand appeared and started writing on the wall. The hand said, Mene, Mene, Tekelu Farsin. He had no idea what it meant. And he called all of his advisors. No one could tell. So even a crazy anti-Semite can have the best advice in the world. He asked his mother what to do. His mother said, I grew up in the court of your grandfather. His greatest advisor was Daniel. Ask the Jew. The Jew can probably figure it out. Daniel looks at the wall and he says, it says that you have been weighed and been found wanting. And from the word of Upharsin, we learn that your kingdom is going to be given over to the Persians. So the king immediately realized that Daniel was right and decided to flip the script. He told Daniel, from now on, you're in control of a third of my kingdom. And he dressed him in royal garments. He suddenly changed how he felt about Daniel. But extremely paranoid, he told his soldiers that anyone you see tonight outside the castle should be killed on sight. Later that night, the king woke up in a drunken stupor and went outside to take some air. And as he did, one of his soldiers, not realizing who he was, killed him. Early the next morning, Koresh, in front of the Persian Median army, attacks the city of Babylon. Looking for their king, they can't find him anywhere. And without leadership, the city is easily taken over. Koresh goes immediately to the palace and kills the entire royal family. However, while looking in the bedroom of Belshazzar for the king, he finds hiding under the bed a young child, a beautiful young girl. And although a man of war, he immediately realized the value of such a child, the political value of the last child of the dynasty of Nebuchadnezzar. So he kidnaps the girl and plans to marry this child to his son, to assure his son's role on the throne. Darius now becomes king of the majority of the known world. This bet that he made, hiring Koresh as the general of his army and even marrying him to his daughter, was a great choice. He becomes king of the known world. However, his joy is short-lived. He's king for less than a year. And in 3390, Koresh becomes king of the entire known world, known as the greatest warrior at that time. A year into his reign, Koresh's advisors come to him with a piece of advice no one has ever given before. They said, "Sir, we did the calculations. There's no question about it. The Jewish prophet said it's going to be 70 years that the Jews are going to be in exile. And of course, those Babylonian ministers were wrong. They were counting from the wrong day. They shouldn't have counted from when the country was conquered by Babylonia. They should have counted from the words of Jeremiah, from that holy prophecy. And this year is 70 years from then. So now we're 100% sure that this year is the end of the 70 years, and this is when God's promises." Now, Koresh had a different point of view on the world than Belshazzar did. Koresh was a winner. He was always winning. He famously once said in one of his speeches, "All my friends are sick of winning, they win so often." He had a battle, he won it. He was a thief, he won the fight. He went to war with the king let him marry his daughter. Wherever he went, he was winning. He saw God as his friend. So he said, if God said after 70 years the Jews are going to return to his home, well, then I want to help with that. Wonderful. Let the Jews return to their home. He gave Zerubbabel, who was the scion of the house of David, permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Over 42,000 Jews joined their king, returning to Israel. And as a reward for his reverence, God gave him a phenomenal gift. Within a week, Koresh was swimming in the rivers outside the castle, and he found 2 sunken ships covered in gold. How they got there, no one knows, unless they came in the beginning of the class. And he became immediately not only the most powerful king in the world, but now the richest king in the world. He has the Guinness Book record. No one has anything on him. Koresh was so grateful to God that he ordered that shittim trees be cut down from the mountains of Lebanon and sent to Jerusalem to help with the rebuilding. However, the joy the Jews felt at the chance to rebuild the temple was short-lived. In 3392, only a little over a year after the Jews began construction, Koresh died. And with that, his young, evil, greedy, selfish, and usually drunk son, Achashverosh, took the throne. Now, before we get into Achashverosh, let's set the scene in Israel at this time. The Jews are back in their homeland. They have the means and the opportunity to rebuild the temple, but they also have enemies. It was an evil tribe at that time called the Samaritans, who lived in Israel and plotted to stop the construction of the temple. They attacked the Jews and harassed them. They tried to hinder them any way they can. And when that failed, they decided to hire a lobbyist. Now, at that time, there was a rule: one had to be of noble birth to step foot in the castle, in the palace of the king. And there was a young man living in the capital city. His name was Haman. Haman was from the royal family of Amalek, of a small tribe. He was noble, but he didn't have any noble coin, just a noble blood. So they said, we'll bankroll your position in the court if you represent our interests. We can't be seen in front of the court. And so he went on behalf of the Samaritans to King Ahasuerus, and he said, the Jews are rebuilding the walls of the Jerusalem, which is what you told them not to do. They're not building the temple. They're building military structures. And hearing this, the king ordered the building stopped. So immediately the Jews sent their representative. They sent a member of the Sanhedrin, a gentleman named Mordecai, who was a direct descendant of Shaul, the first king of Israel, also with noble blood. And he said, we're just following the instructions of your father. Your father said we can build not the walls of Jerusalem, but the walls of the temple. And Ahasuerus was faced to make his first decision as king. And like any terrible king, he pushed the decision off as much as possible. In 3393, there was a rebellion in India. So Ahasuerus took these two advisors, representing the two sides of the debate, and said, I'm giving each one of you an army of 6,000 men. I want you to go to India and reconquer the city. It should take about 3 years. When you come back, I'll decide which one of you is right. And so they go. Now Mordecai had the complete respect of his men. But Haman, as he mentioned, was an upstart. He had no background in this, and his men didn't respect him. So he thought he could gain their respect by being overly kind. And they quickly went through all the stocks they had for this 3-year siege. Realizing this, Haman comes to the other general, to Mordecai. He says, I need more supplies. Mordecai says, I can't give you more supplies. I was given 3 years of stocks by the king because I'm supposed to be here for 3 years. I can't harm my men to help yours. And Haman pointed out that without his half of the army, it would be hard pressed to win the battle. And he insinuated that if Mordecai wouldn't help him, he would go back to the king and use his time there to attack the Jewish people. So Mordecai agrees to help him on one condition. Mordecai says, I don't trust you to disperse the food. The reason I don't trust you is because the last time you had stockpiles of food, you immediately gave. So here's what we'll do. I'll give you all the food your thousands of men need if you promise that one day a week, be my slave. Anything I say jump, you say how high. That way I can give you food and I know you'll disperse it exactly how I command. Haman says, deal, no problem. So Mordecai takes his military boot, his jambu, and he writes on it, Haman will be the slave of Mordecai one day a week. They both sign. Now with less provisions, Mordecai improvised a plan using both their forces to conquer the city. And in short time, they conquered the city and the deal was quickly forgotten and never. It's at this point that we've reached the first line of the Megillah. Rabbi Bernath, do you want to pause for questions here or should we continue?
I think we can take a few questions. We have a few questions coming in. Somebody asked, were there bad Samaritans, ?
So that's an excellent question. For those who are familiar with terms that came from our brother's book, or our cousin's book, whatever, there's a term Good Samaritan. Good Samaritan is a term because it's the exception that proves the rule. Even at the time that their book was written, the Samaritans were known as a spiteful, angry, hateful tribe. But there was one Samaritan who gave someone a glass of water when he was dying. And he's remembered as the Good Samaritan. Not that he was an incredibly good person, but compared to the rest of his tribe, he was a uniquely kind individual. Because of that one act of kindness, the entire legacy of his people transferred from being one of evil to being one of kindness. It shows you the tremendous ability of one person who was nice to someone one day, gave him a glass of water, and forever changed how people saw him. So they were only bad Samaritans. There was one guy who once had a good day.
Does anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Any questions so far in the story? Not all at once, please. Okay, I guess no one has any questions in the story. Okay, so let's get started. So Rabbi Litvin, you are up to the part of the story that has to do with...
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Oh, please.
Can you just explain, you said the words that were written on the wall, one of them proves that it was Persia or something like that. Can you explain that, please?
So it doesn't prove it was Persia. Daniel was a prophet. He was able to see the words that God had written there and take tremendous meaning. The words technically means weighed and have been found wanting. He said, we learned from the first half, you've been weighed and weighed again. Teaches us the entire lesson. You don't weigh something twice unless it doesn't weigh the right amount. And from the second half of the expression, we can also learn that the person who will take it away, so the word lacking means you'll have everything taken away. And ufarsin, paras, is Persia in Hebrew. So paras, farsin, that's going to be who takes it away, the country of Persia. So it's not an obvious lesson. It was a lesson a prophet of God was able to intuit from those words. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Sure, please.
I'd like to know this story about Haman and Mordecai when they're out warring. You don't hear that in the Megillah itself. Where does it come from?
So we are pulling today from a variety of sources. That particular source is found in the book, the Talmud tractate of Megillah. So within the Talmud tractate, it expands on certain points of the story that are necessary to understand the story, at least according to the rabbis at the time. And that is where that part of the story is found.
Thank you very much.
And in answer to Maria's question, 3338 is when the temple was destroyed.
Okay. Anyone else? Or can we continue?
I have a question.
Please.
I'm wondering about this deal that Mordecai made with Haman to be his slave once a week. I mean, we don't really believe in slaves. We have a whole, there's a big framework around that. Everything is very, according to halacha. Where did he get this idea from to make that kind of a deal?
So there are certainly places in halacha where owning a non-Jewish slave, a Canaanite slave, is possible. If you don't like the word slavery, slavery has, especially in modern history, negative connotations. I'm using the word eved, which is commonly translated as slave. You could equally say indentured servitude. The concern was he could not trust Haman to distribute the food properly on his own. So he had to have full control of his actions in order to be willing to risk the provisions he needed to keep his men alive. So one could equally say indentured servitude, his slave, his bondsman, any of these words would be appropriate. And there are certainly, within halacha, you can find such a framework. Within Jewish law, you can find such a framework.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Rabbi Litvin, I think you can continue. And I guess we are at the opening words of the Megillat Esther. If anyone has a Megillat Esther, you're welcome to follow along as the story continues.
The Megillah begins, as we heard the techno version of the first line of the Megillah, Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh. And it was in the days of Achashverosh, he Achashverosh. The rabbis have a severe argument in the Talmud. When it says, yeah, that Achashverosh, is that a positive or a negative? It could either mean, yeah, that Achashverosh who ruled the entire world, or yeah, that guy. Sorry, we have to talk about him. And the rabbis say, either way, it doesn't matter. Both facts were true. We're just not sure which one Esther was hinting at when she wrote the Megillah. Now, if you notice, the Megillah treats Achashverosh, who was a horrible, evil anti-Semite, with kid gloves. The reason they do so is because Achashverosh was still alive to read the Megillah when they wrote it. So they try to be as pleasant as possible. They don't praise him. because they couldn't lie, but they leave a lot of his wickedness in the, you have to figure a little bit out for yourself, because they trusted Achashverosh couldn't figure anything out for himself. So Achashverosh, in the first lines of the Megillah, is throwing a huge party. It's the third year of his reign. And he's celebrating a few things. Number one, the recent rebellion that he was so worried about in India had fallen. The second thing is, his wife was finally old enough. She had reached the age of full maturity, and their marriage was recognized throughout the kingdom. And he had more security upon his throne now that he was married to Vashti. And third, he had completed building his capital city, complete with a replica of Solomon's throne. There was a famous throne of King Solomon. It was remarkably made with gold and gems, with perfectly carved animals. The animals would actually work, they would lift you from each step to the next step. And it was known as the throne which Solomon ruled the world from. After the conquering the land of Israel, it fell into the hands of Egypt and Pharaoh Necho, which translates to King Cripple. And he was so called because of the injury sustained when trying to climb the throne. He tried to climb the throne. He was thrown off and broke his legs so poorly that he wasn't able to walk again. Nebuchadnezzar conquered the throne from him, and he also was unable to climb the throne. Darius couldn't climb the throne, and Achashverosh was too scared to even try to climb the throne. However, what ruled Achashverosh's mind completely was an inferiority complex. Everything was about security of his throne. And he thought, if I appearances are everything to someone who has an inferiority complex. He says, if I'm sitting on Solomon's throne in a new capital city in the center of the world, with the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar at my side, and my armies have just finished conquering the outlying provinces of my country, I'm really the king. So he had a lot to celebrate. The reasons he was celebrating. But the biggest reason he was celebrating was his advisors came to him and they said, Your Majesty, no one has ever told a king this before, but you know that 70-year program that we had, that Jeremiah said 70 years the Jews will be enslaved? Well, the silly Babylonians counted from when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judea. Of course, that was the wrong time to count from. And the silly Medians counted from when Yirmiyahu gave the prophecy. But we're much smarter. We know that you should count from when King Yechaniah was exiled. And at the end of this year, those 70 years will be up. So as he prepared to throw the party, he realized the 70 years were now going to be up, and he can now dwell securely, knowing that the God of the Jews is not going to redeem his people. Achashverosh had a dream as a young man that his throne would be inherited by a Jew. So he had to double down this fear that Belshazzar had and Nebuchadnezzar had of the Jewish people. But now his advisors had assured him the 70 years are up. And as we know, no one's ever been wrong about this before. So it must be that if the 70 years are up, the 70 years are up. The party went on for 6 months, 180 days. All the nobles from all across the world were there. He showered them with incredible wealth. Anytime someone finished drinking from a golden goblet, he gave them the goblet. Every person was only given wine older than himself. His queen threw a similar party. She threw a party for 2 reasons. Number one, she's a savvy politician. She wanted to be shown to be equal to her husband. Number 2, she held the women hostage so that no one should make any attempt on her husband's life during this party. And as a side benefit, she was an incredibly vile and lewd woman. And she enjoyed the idea of having a side-by-side party. And at night, she would force her servants, many of them Jews she had captured from the Jewish community, to go among the men at the party and debase themselves on pain of death. She took special delight in humiliating and assaulting Jewish women, and especially attacking their modesty. At the end of this incredible 180-day feast, the king again threw a 7-day feast, this for the inhabitants of his capital city. Again, even as the entire world was bowing before him, Achashverosh, with his inferiority complex, believed that one day I might be overthrown. And if I am, I'll need somewhere to hide, my capital city. So I need my people loyal to me. So he threw a huge party and demanded everyone in the city come. Mordecai begged the Jews not to come, and they refused. They went anyways, many of them. They sinned and indulged in the many pleasures at the feast, which is exactly what Haman, who helped plan the feast, was hoping for. On the seventh day, however, none of the Jews came to the feast. The only Jew who came to the feast, interestingly enough, was Mordecai, who had been ordered personally to be there to represent the Jewish community. On the seventh day, it was Yom Kippur, and all the Jews stayed home. Achashverosh became drunk, and like any drunk brute, he started talking about women because he had nothing intelligent to say. And he started arguing with the people of the city who was the most beautiful woman in the world. Each one said, my culture. And as a man who had no culture, was from no people, his father was raised by dogs, he said, no, Babylonian women are the most beautiful. My wife Vashti is the most beautiful woman in the world. And I'll even have her come before you and show you she's the most beautiful woman in the world. His servant said, listen, any person looks beautiful dressed like the queen. So he said, my wife will have no problem coming here naked. And normally Vashti would have no issue with it. She was a vain and evil and lewd woman. However, as she prepared to emerge, Angel Gabriel came and caused her to have leprosy and have a growth on her back, similar to a tail. Unable to back down, she instead lashed out at her husband. She told the servants to go loudly tell your foolish master that in my father, who was a real king's home, he wouldn't be good enough to clean the horse's stable. My father could consume vast quantities of wine without any effect, while this king can barely drink anything, he becomes drunk. The king was obviously furious, but he wanted a way to back out. So he summoned the Jewish elders to come to the feast and give an answer. The rabbis realize there's a no-win situation when someone tells you, do you think my wife's a jerk? Never, that's a trick question. Never answer that question. What do you think of my girlfriend? Bad. No. I have no opinion. You broke up with her? I still have no opinion. Because if you're back with her next week, I'm the one that's in trouble. So the Jewish rabbis, the temple was destroyed. We can't give wise advice anymore. So he then turned to the other advisors, and one of them, a junior advisor, Haman, jumps forward and he says, you should kill her, and you should make a law that any woman who disobeys her husband should be killed. In this, he saw a way both to gain power in the court and in his household where his wife ran over him. The next morning, the king woke up. I know I've had one or two Purim mornings where I woke up a little groggy about what happened the night before. Thankfully, I never killed anybody. He wakes up, he says, where's my wife? They said, you don't remember? He said, no. They said, okay, Jerry's going to tell you what happened. I'm not telling you. Eventually, someone told the king what happened, and he fell into a horrible depression. Not only because of his now imagined love for his wife, but because of his recognition that he lost stability in his kingdom. His advisors, seeing that he was ignoring affairs of state, tried to seek him out of his depression. They said, how about we have a pageant? We'll scour the kingdom, and every night we'll bring you a beautiful woman from another part of the kingdom. You'll share the night with her, and in the morning, you'll decide if she'll be queen or not. If she won't be queen, she'll be put in a harem, because once a woman has been with a king, she could never leave the palace again. And eventually, you'll find your queen. And so it goes for a full year, and they couldn't find anyone. And finally, one of the advisors finds a woman living directly in the capital city, a young girl named Hadassah. Hadassah was living in the home of her elder family member Mordecai. Her parents had died, her father before she was born, her mother at birth. Her uncle Mordecai was a descendant of Shaul, as we mentioned, and had been exiled 72 years earlier, with the servants of Yechaniah. And she was called Hadassah, or Myrtle. for two reasons. Number one, she had an olive complexion. And number two, because a myrtle is an evergreen, that no matter what is around it, it stays the same. And so was Hadassah. No matter what her area she was in, she remained a kind, noble, righteous Jewish woman. Now, the rabbis argue whether she was naturally beautiful or she was plain looking or even not beautiful, the opposite. Rather, God made her appear pleasant to everyone who saw her. But regardless, they agree that whoever saw her was impressed. Hoping to dissuade the king from any interest, when the guards first saw her, Esther quickly sought out an older man to marry. Many rabbis agree the older man was her cousin Mordechai, who she married. But either way, she quickly got married to an older man, thinking that having now been in a relationship, she would be no longer fit for the king. They disagreed and they decided to take her anyways. So Mordechai cautioned her to go by the name Esther. He said Esther is perfect for three reasons. In Hebrew, it means hidden. In Aramaic, it means myrtle, which is the same as Hadassah. And in Persian, it means beautiful. Ishtar is Venus, the goddess of beauty. And while Esther had always successfully escaped the notice of men before, as she was brought to the palace, she immediately found favor in everyone who saw her. Chagai, the eunuch who ran the harem, the second he saw her, realized that she would win this competition. So he treated her different than every other woman. He gave her her own chamber separate from the other women. He gave her 7 servants, and she immediately said, one of you will serve me every day of the week. She realized that if one servant would serve her on Shabbos and not the other days, she would think she's just lazy and doesn't like lighting fires for herself, while the other servants would think she light fires every day of the week. And all the various changes of Shabbos, the servants wouldn't notice because they weren't there both days. And despite her humble presentation and refusal to disclose who she was, the king chose her as the queen. Eager to impress her and worried why she wouldn't tell him who she was, he asked for her advice. How could I be a better king? And she gave great advice. She says, I grew up learning of the great Babylonian and Median kings. They all had Jewish advisors. You don't have any Jewish advisors. So go to the Jews, seek out one of their leaders, and make him your advisor. He said, who's a Jewish leader? She goes, I don't know. That guy looks like a Jewish leader. And so Mordechai became one of the king's advisors and guarding the king's gate. So the king said, Mordechai, you're supposed to be so wise. How do I make my wife fall in love with me? And Mordechai, in his only piece of bad advice, seeking to give the king bad advice, told him you should make her jealous. That's the way to win a woman's heart. I don't know if the love rabbi will agree with that. He said, make a second pageant. Look for a different woman, and that will win her over. What Mordechai was hoping was that Achashverosh indeed would find another woman and would let Esther go. Of course, as we know, that didn't happen, and Esther was cemented as the queen. During this time, while guarding the gate, as his duties were now as a minister of the king, Mordechai, who was a master linguist, overheard the plans of 2 of the king's servants to kill him. Bigsan and Seresh were nobles of the Babylonian Empire, cousins of Vashti, who wished to kill the king and bring back their family's dynasty. Through Haman, actually, they had made a deal with the Greek Empire, which was emerging in the west, to together split up the kingdom of Achashverosh. Mordechai relayed this information to Esther, who told King Achashverosh in the name of Mordechai, giving him credit, as we all should when quoting someone. And the traitors were killed, Bigsan and Seresh, and the entire episode was recorded for posterity in the Chronicles of the Land. During this time, Esther gave birth to her only child, Daryavish. Now it's interesting, there's a dispute among the experts in the history of who the father of this child was. It's possible that Esther's husband was the father of this child, her true husband, so Mordechai, and it's possible Achashverosh was the father of this child. Regardless, whoever the father was, as we know, Judaism is matrilineal descent, so Esther's child was a Jew. At this time, the king decided to raise Haman over all his other advisors. He ordered everyone to show respect to Haman and bow down to him. Haman used to wear an idol around his neck so that everyone who bowed down to him would also bow down to the God of his forefathers. But Mordechai refused to bow. He explained that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin wasn't born when Jacob first met Esau and all the family bowed. He said, I'm the only Jewish tribe that's never bowed to anyone, and I'm not going to start now. So Haman said, I'll take you to court. There's a new law. You have to bow to me. And so the next day, Mordechai came to court wearing his military boot that said on it, written with both their signatures, that Haman will be a slave to Mordechai. He said, if you want to make legal claims, we both have legal claims we can make. Haman, realizing this, backed down. Furious at Mordechai, and with a long-standing family legacy of destruction of our people, Haman decided to set his plans into action. He was now a man of power and he had the opportunity, but he wanted to see if fates would favor him. So he took 2 lots, one with 354 days, the amount of days in a lunar calendar, and one 12 for months. He wanted to make sure that the fates would encourage his plan. So he picked 1 month and 1 day. Anyone who's good with math can see if you pick a certain number, if you pick the number 38, you have to pick the month 2 for those two to equal up. And he chose the day 338 and the month 12. It was perfect. It came out to the 14th day of Adar. Haman was happy for 2 reasons. Number 1, he knew Adar was a negative month for the Jews. The 7th of Adar is the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu. It was the day that Moses, the greatest of all Jewish leaders, passed away. He also knew that the sign for Adar, the astrological sign, was a fish. And he said fish is the only predator that when they swallow their enemy, they swallow them whole. When a lion kills a wildebeest, he leaves behind bones. But a fish can swallow another fish, leave nothing behind. What he forgot was 2 things. The first is that although Moshe died in Adar, he was also born in Adar. And he forgot when it comes to fish, no matter how large a predator fish is, there's always a bigger fish. And just like a fish can swallow someone else whole, that fish can be swallowed whole as well. So he then went to the king and he told him of these people who are spread out across the land. He offered the king 10,000 talents of silver for the opportunity to kill the Jews. The king, who had this prophecy of the Jew wearing his crown in his mind and who was anti-Semite himself, was incredibly happy. Yes, go kill the Jews. He gave his ring to Haman with the full weight of the empire, who sent an ambiguous message, telling people 11 months from today, someone is going to be killed. Now, I can ask anybody in this chat, if you got an email, 11 months from today, a certain people in Canada are all going to be killed, every one of us would know it was the Jews. Of course it's the Jews. Who else is it going to be? So although this was his plan to keep it a secret, it didn't become a secret very long. And Mordechai donned sackcloth and ashes and walked through the streets, trying to stir the Jews to repent. On this very first day, Mordechai's walking through the street and he sees a few children on their way home from school. He comes up to them and Haman is walking across the street. And Mordechai calls out to the children. He says to the first boy, what line? This is before the children had books, before the oral Torah, so they'd learned the Torah by heart. So he said, tell me the line you memorized in school today. And the small child said, Al tir mi pachat pisam, do not fear sudden terror, nor the destruction of the wicked when it comes. He said to the second boy, what'd you learn today? He said, I learned, contrive a scheme, but it will be foiled, conspire a plot, but it will not materialize, for God is with us. And the third boy said, I learned, to your old age, I am with you. To your old years, I will sustain you. I have made you. I will carry you. I will sustain you and deliver you. And Mordechai, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, fully aware that a decree was just passed to kill all the Jews, begins to smile. Haman, furious, comes across the street and says, Mordechai, why are you so happy? And Mordechai replied, I'm happy because of the good words they told me. I'm not afraid of the evil plot you have against us. Flying into a rage, Haman promised that the children will be the first Jews that get killed. When Esther in the palace heard that Mordechai was acting in such a fashion, walking among the Jews in sackcloth and ashes, she sent her most trusted servant, Hassach, which was the Persian name for Daniel, the prophet, who we mentioned before, to go bring new clothes to Mordechai. Mordechai sent a message back, insisting she go before the king and pray for her people. Esther sent a message back explaining that if you remember that law that Haman helped make, Haman's law was anyone who disobeys their husband, like shows up in his courtroom without his permission, can be killed. It's my life if I go. And Mordechai sent back, maybe this is the exact reason that God put you in this situation. Mordechai goes a little stronger. He says, if the Jews get killed, don't think you'll survive. You'll be erased from history. This is your moment. At this point, Haman noticed that Hassach was being used to send messages back and forth. Now, while he didn't know Esther was Jewish, he thought perhaps the Jews are trying to convince the queen to listen on their behalf, even though she isn't Jewish. They're lobbying the queen. So he killed the messenger. This is a huge mistake because, of course, we know throughout Jewish history, any time that a Jewish leader, a Jewish prophet, or a holy Jew passes away, it brings merit for all the Jewish people. And this was a time where the Jewish people needed great forgiveness and merit. So Esther, unable to have a conversation anymore, she makes an executive decision. She sends a message to Mordechai. Here's what we're going to do. For the next 3 days, all the Jews in the world are going to fast. And after 3 days, I'll go before the king. And in one of the most beautiful words in the entire Torah, Esther says, "Kasher avadati avadati." Whatever will happen to me will happen to me. I accept it. Now, it's obvious that Esther was risking her life by going before the king. He could kill her. But there's another phenomenal thing that often people don't talk about. According to Jewish law, a woman who engages with another man outside of her marriage is forever forbidden to her husband. She can never again go back to her husband. If, God forbid, a woman is forced outside of her marriage, she is allowed to return to her husband. Until this point, Esther had a dream that one day Achashverosh would die. She would be forgotten and be able to return to the Jewish people, be able to return to her husband, to live a happy Jewish life. But by this option of choosing to go to the king of her own volition, she is now engaging outside of her marriage. By choosing to represent the Jews in this moment, Esther is forever losing her chance at a happy ending. There's remarkable self-sacrifice. I didn't see the word self-sacrifice in the word cloud vision tunnel thing. I don't know. I'm not so fancy. I don't know what the things are called that we had before. But I would have put selfless or self-sacrifice as my biggest word. It's a remarkable moment where one person gives up any hope of a happy ending for their lives in order to support and help their fellow Jews. Despite the fact that Esther's request of fasting for 3 days meant canceling the Seder, Mordechai issued the news of the fast. At the end of the 3 days, Esther indeed prepared herself and went before the king. As she approached the king, he said, "How dare she? How dare she come to my mission?" He thought I should order her death. But again, Gabriel, who had condemned one queen, now rescues the other and forces Achashverosh to put out his royal scepter. The second that she came into the room, though, the king realized he didn't want to lose another queen. And realizing Esther would never risk her life if there wasn't something important, he asked, "Ask anything of me up till half my kingdom." He said half my kingdom because he didn't want to give away Jerusalem. He was afraid if he ever gave away Jerusalem, the Jews would gain it again, and his kingdom would fall. Esther said, "It's very simple. I don't need anything. All I want is for my master and king to come to a party in my house tonight, together with his prime minister." Now, there were many reasons that Esther wanted Haman at this party. The first is she didn't want to give Haman a time to scour around the palace, gaining more support. He was a wily politician. Number two, she didn't want to tip her hand to Haman. He already knew about Hassach. She didn't want him to think that she was against him. Number three, any way to increase jealousy and suspicion in her husband, who she knew suffered from inferiority, she thought was helpful. And number 4, she knew that Achashverosh often gave in to his impulses. And she thought, if I get the king to want to kill Haman, I want him near at hand. And lastly, for human sake, she knew that pride cometh before the fall, and good wine often helps that fall. So getting Haman prideful and drunk would be useful to her. But above all that, she had 2 central reasons. Number 1, she wanted God to see her serving Haman, serving him food and wine. She wanted to invoke God's rage and God's mercy. And last, she didn't want the Jews to think, we don't have to pray to God, we have Esther in the palace. So this act of betrayal of her people, she thought that her people should think she's a traitor and turn to God rather than to Esther. At this party, although she was still fasting, Esther gave food and wine to both of them, fulfilling their every wish. And finally, the king says to Esther, this was a great meal, but what do you want? I'll offer you anything up till half my kingdom. And Esther said, all I want is for the 2 of you to join me again tomorrow night, and I'll reveal to you my nationality and culture. Now, Haman left this party in a phenomenal mood. Everything was going his way. It was all aces for Haman. And, excuse me. As he passed by Mordecai standing at the gate, he saw Mordecai wearing his armored boot. And his anger was so overwhelming that the only thing that held him back from killing Mordecai in that moment was needing royal permission. So he rushed home, and his wife was waiting for him, an evil woman, the perfect partner to an evil man. And he gathered her together and his many, many sons and his friends and advisors. And he asked him, how can we kill Mordecai? His wife said, Jews can't be killed by water. Someone once tried to drive them into the sea, and Moses split the sea. They can't be killed by the sword. We've seen that many times in history. They can't be killed in many ways, but no one's ever tried hanging them. That's probably the best way to kill a Jew, especially because that she knew that black magic can only be done when touching the ground. So if what the Jews or the Jewish voodoo is magic, it won't be able to work. And so he builds a 75-foot tall gallows. It says that his son found a 75-foot piece of wood on a mountain outside the capital. Another time where it mentions 75-foot pieces of wood being on a mountain is in the story of Noah. He lands on a mountain in Iran. So it's probably the same boat. And in good spirits, Haman tries on the gallows before he goes to see the king. And at that moment, a heavenly voice declared it's a good fit, and Haman's fate was sealed. That night, throughout the city of Shushan, Haman was up with his friends planning the demise of the Jews. The Jews, terrified, were praying to God for help. Esther was strategizing for the next day, and Achashverosh was asleep drunk. And it bothered Gabriel. Gabriel said, the Holy One, blessed be he, is restless, stirred by the repentance of his people. How could this king be sleeping? So he threw him out of his bed. Achashverosh had never woken up in the middle of the night before. Can you imagine being so self-sufficient that you've never had something to wake up in the middle of the night? And he thought, I must be poisoned. That's why I woke up. Who would try to kill me? I'm such a great guy. He said, maybe I owe something to someone, and that's why he betrayed me. So he called for the royal chronicles. Shoshi, the chief scribe of the royal chronicles, was a son of Haman. And when he said, open the chronicles and read me something, either I'll be assured by it, or at least it'll put me to sleep. If you ever, by the way, are very tired, you can't go to sleep, try reading the minutes of the Congress or of the Parliament of Canada, and I'm sure you'll fall right asleep. So the king says, read me the chronicles. And 3 times, Shoshi tries to find a different story than the one he opened up to, but finally the king says, read. And he's forced to read the story of Mordecai, who told the queen of these 2 men who tried to kill the king. And the king says, how was Mordecai rewarded? He said he wasn't rewarded. In fact, the king's servants jumped forward, not out of love for Mordecai, but out of envy and hatred for Haman, They said, oh, Mordecai was never rewarded. Reward Mordecai. That'll bug Haman. And the king said, good. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to give him a short-lasting reward, an immediate reward, and a long-lasting reward. Now, satisfied that he had solved every problem in the world, the king went to sleep, but woke minutes later, having a terrifying dream of Haman standing over him with a sword. He awoke to noise in the courtyard, and he asked, what's going on? They said, Haman's outside demanding to see you. Haman was coming to ask permission to kill Mordecai. And the king was curious. What's the depths of Haman's ambition? So he told Haman, there's someone I want to honor. What should I do to that person? And Haman said, well, who would the king want to honor besides me? You should dress him in your royal clothes, put him on your royal horse, crown him with your royal crown, and march him through the cities, saying, thus shall be done to the man that the king wishes to honor. Achashverosh was thrilled. Number one, he knew that he can now see who Haman was. Number two, he always had this prophecy that a Jew would one day wear his crown. Here, if he gave his crown to Mordecai for an hour, he could maybe fulfill that prophecy. So he told Haman, do what you just suggested to Mordecai. Haman tried to backtrack. He said, who is this Mordecai? I don't know who it is. He said, Mordecai the Jew. He says, there's a lot of Jews named Mordecai. The king said, Mordecai, who sits at the gate. And Haman, still trying to back out, and said, maybe you should, instead of this present, give him a river or a village to tax. Maybe give him a bridge. And the king said, good, do all those things, but first, I like this idea, march him through the city. So Haman set out to find Mordecai, and he found him in the house of study early in the morning, teaching a young group of rabbis the laws of measurements. When the rabbi saw Haman coming, Mordecai ordered them to flee, and he himself wrapped himself in a tallis and began to pray. When he finished praying, Haman asked him, what were you studying with your students? He said, we were studying the measurements of flour in the Holy Temple. When it says a fistful of flour in the temple, what it means is you go like this with two fingers and you hold the flour. That's what we were studying. And bitter, Haman exclaimed that your handful of flour outweighed my 10,000 talents of silver I paid the king. Mordecai looked at Haman and said, villain, what do you mean your 10,000 talents of silver? You're an indentured servant to me. Anything you own, I own. And then Haman explained to Mordecai why he was there, but Mordecai refused to go. He said, I haven't showered or trimmed in 3 days. I have to get ready to wear the king's garments. Now Esther had heard in the palace almost immediately of this plan of her husband's. So she arrested every barber and bath attendant in the capital. She wanted Haman to be forced to do this demeaning job himself. And when he complained to Mordecai, it was beneath him. Mordecai pointed out that before he was hired as a lobbyist for the Samaritans, he had been a barber himself. Finally bathed and cleaned and cut, Mordecai went to the king's horse, but Mordecai said, I'm too weak to climb on such a tall animal, an impressive beast. So Haman knelt down to allow Mordecai to use him as a stool. And when he did, Mordecai kicked him in the ribs. Haman complained. He said, the Torah says you shouldn't rejoice in the downfall of your enemy. And Mordecai says, no, that's talking about your Jewish enemy, referring to the enemies of the Jewish people. Mordecai said, the Torah says we should tread on their high places. Mordecai was led all around the city as Haman had to say, thus shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor. As he approached his own home, his daughter, who knew why he went to the king, figured that before her father killed Mordecai, he wanted to embarrass him. And so she took the chamber pot from her bathroom and poured it on the guy leading the horse's head. When the man looked up and she realized it was her father, terrified of his reaction, she jumped to her death. Mordecai returned immediately to the king's gate. In tears, he was horrified. Until this point, he thought perhaps this chip that I have to play, that I once saved the king's life, might spare the Jews. But now he lost it all on a personal honor, something that was worth nothing to him. He didn't want to be rich. He didn't want to be honored. He wanted to save his people. And Haman returned home furious because of his day. His wife explained to him that he better run now and beg Mordecai for forgiveness, beg him for mercy. She said, the Jews are like the sand and the stars. When they're down, but when they're up, they're up. And before he could do anything, The royal guard barged into his home, demanding his presence at the queen's chamber. The king and Haman both sat in Esther's quarters in the afternoon, disturbed by the long day's events, drinking the wine that Esther laid out. And the king was in good spirits after some good spirits. And again, he asked the queen, "What can I do for you?" Esther realizes this is her moment. And in a double terminology, she says, "To God, if I have found favor in your eyes, my king," and then repeats the word king and says, "If it pleases the king, looking at Achashverosh, let my life be my request and my people my petition." She explained that I'm a king, I'm a queen, so anything that's yours is mine, I'm your wife, but what is it worth if my people are going to be killed? I'm royalty from the house of King Shaul, the king of the Jews. And I would only do what's good for my king. So if all the Jews had been sold as slaves, I wouldn't complain, I wouldn't make problems. If all the Jews lost their possessions or were banned from the country, I wouldn't say anything. But I'm afraid if you try to kill the Jews, the God of my people will punish you. And I only want what's best for the king. This enemy who wants to destroy me doesn't care what's going to happen to you. He's driven by pure and reasonable hate. He killed Vashti, and now he conspires to kill me, knowing you'll lose far more than the silver he offered you. He doesn't care for your welfare, he cares for my destruction. Achashverosh certainly realized something in his booze-addled brain. He said, "One second, if my wife is a Jewess, my son is a Jew. This terrifying thought I had of my crown being worn by a Jew is now good news. It means my son will rule after I die." And trying to explain himself to his wife, he says, who could have done this? Who could have had this horrible plan that I was involved in planning? Esther responded, "This hateful enemy Haman," listing all of his sins and her suspicions of his involvement in the plots against herself, against the king, holding nothing back and pleading to God for help. Hearing Esther pour her heart out both to him and to God, Achashverosh needed a moment, and he stepped outside to get some fresh air, and he saw there angels disguised as men cutting down his favorite trees in his orchard. When he asked them whose authority this was done on, they said, "The master of the house, Haman." The king, even more arranged, stormed back into the banquet. In the meantime, Haman had knelt at Esther's feet, begging for his life, as his family has advised him. And when the king entered, he tried to stand and tripped and sprawled out onto Esther, who was laying on a couch. And in a last desperate move, he tried to make it seem as if there was something untoward happening between him and Esther. When Esther protested, the king exploded in anger. "In me babayas," he says, "with me in the house you do such a thing." And he immediately told the guards, "Cover Haman's face with black cloth, so he may never see the king again." Terrified, Haman broke out in a rash across his entire body, and in death his outer self would reflect the ugliness and decay of his heart. Suddenly one of the king's guards, Charvona, jumps forward. He says, "Your Majesty, it's worse than you think. Look out the window. Do you see those gallows? Those were built by Haman to kill Mordechai." Now, Charvona was actually one of Haman's advisors. Until this point, he had been an enemy of the Jews. But here he saw the wind shifting, and he wanted to protect himself. The king ordered that very day Haman should be hung on the gallows he built for his enemy. Haman, evil to the last moment, asked if I could please be beheaded instead of hung. Beheading was an appropriate punishment for a royal advisor. And he realized that if he was beheaded, his decree to kill the Jews would still carry weight. Mordechai ordered that he be hung, and the king ordered an umbrella be built over his body so the birds won't eat it and he could watch it slowly rot from the palace. As soon as Haman was dead, the king's great anger and anxiety melted away. The king then spoke nicely to the queen and Mordechai. He named Mordechai as his advisor in the place of Haman. And he gave Mordechai refuge in the temple, in the palace from the family of Haman. But Esther once again falls before the king, begging for her people who were still decreed to be killed. Now, Mr. Inferiority Complex King refused to rescind an order that he had already given. He said, "If I rescind my orders, it'll make me seem weak, but I'll give a second order. I'll give a second order that the Jews should be armed and the Jews should defend themselves." Such a decree was issued and the Jews readied themselves for war. Mordecai left the palace wearing the royal crown with his tzitzis and his tefillin. He wanted the people of Shushan to be fully aware the times had changed and the Jews could now proudly celebrate their faith in public. As others approached, the Jews readied for war. They sought out who their enemies were, both open and hidden. In awe of Mordecai, the new advisor of the king, the governors and leaders across the world helped the Jews. And knowing that their victory would not be due to military strength, but rather to God's power, instead of preparing for war, the Jews fasted on the day before the battle, confident that God would help them. Across the empire, the Jews won incredible battles, defeating and killing their enemy wherever they were found. In the capital city itself, 500 prominent men, most of them advisors and friends and sons of Haman, were killed. And in addition, his 10 most prominent sons were hung publicly from a single gallows. Despite having the right to take gold from anyone they killed to loot the bodies, the Jews refused all treasure, showing this was not a fight for power, but a matter of principle. Also, as many of these men were from the tribe of Amalek, according to our laws, the Jews could not benefit from their possessions. This, in fact, rectified the earlier sin of King Shaul, who benefited financially from his wars against Amalek. Once again, Esther came before the king. The king started off by saying, "I've done too much for the Jews already." And Gavriel acted one more time, slapping the king across the face as he began to speak. Dazed, the king thought it over again and said, "Your Majesty, what can I do for you? My dear queen." And she asked for one more day of battle in Shushan, where the leaders of the enemies of the Jews still lived. So indeed, they were given another day, and Shoshi led the anti-Semitic forces, the favorite son of Haman, the scribe. He was killed by the sword, and Haman's wife and his younger minor sons fled, forced to live off charity the rest of their life. Again, the spoils of war were not touched, and the treasures of over 75,000 men who were killed across the country were given to the king, filling the royal coffers which had been empty. While the Jews of Shushan finished their battle, Jews across the world celebrated, and the next day the Jews of Shushan joined their brothers in celebration. Mordecai sent out an edict all over the world with the words of Esther, naming the holiday Purim for the ill-fated lots of Haman, and should be celebrated for all times. Now, the Torah said we can't add a holiday where you don't work. So he removed the prohibition of work and replaced it with charity and gifts. And he ordered, and the Jews themselves chose to begin a fast day to honor Esther every year. To make sure the story wasn't forgotten, Esther, with her full authority as queen, and Mordecai, with his full authority as a member of Sanhedrin, wrote a joint letter telling the Jews to read the story once a year. The Sanhedrin actually wanted to celebrate Purim on the second day of Passover, when Haman was killed. But Esther stood up to them and said, no, it should be celebrated on the day of the battle. And the Sanhedrin bowed to her superior wisdom and moved the day of the holiday to the 14th day of Adar. With newfound confidence and newfound money, Ahasuerus conquered the last few islands he didn't already own. He abolished taxes for the Jews and at the same time doubled the size of his kingdom and power. Now, while some rabbis were perturbed that Mordecai would take so much time off his Torah studies to run the kingdom, none could deny he stayed a proud and faithful Jew, and his leadership was respected by all the Jews, which was a miracle in and of itself. 2 years later, in 3406, Ahasuerus died, leaving his wealth and throne to his only son Darius. Although a very young man with many conflicting advisors, he soon ordered the rebuilding of the temple. And so, "70 years after 3338, the destruction of the temple began to be rebuilt in 3408 on the orders of Darius, the Jewish king of Persia. Darius allowed all those who wanted to return to go, and a group of 1,500 were led by Ezra the scribe to Jerusalem. The Jews lived in peace and prosperity under Darius, but sadly, many fell into their old ways, straying from God. And over the next 30 years, the Jews lived in prosperity, but many of them strayed. in the year 3442, the Persian Empire was defeated at the hands of the Greeks, and Eretz Yisrael and the Holy Temple fell into disputed territory. This is also the beginning of a wonderful Jewish story, which we call Hanukkah, but that's a different discussion for a different day. Now, while the Greeks and Persians have both come and gone, our people have remained. So we conclude with a fervent prayer to soon return to our land and again rebuild our Holy Temple with the coming of Mashiach. May it be immediately in our days, L'chaim.
Thank you, Rabbi Litvin. Wow. I sat here glued to my seat. There's so many pieces of the story that I had not known before, and I'm really happy. And thank you for being here with us. Let's start off with a couple questions. I'm sure some of you have questions. A couple of you were sending me questions during this story, so I answered those that I could answer. But please, if you have any questions, you're welcome to send them to me privately. You're welcome to unmute yourself.
I think our official has a question.
Official, you have a question? Official, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
How's that?
That's good.
All right. Rabbi, we learned that during the kingdom of Ahasuerus, the Jews that lived in that empire had quite a bit of friction and division among them. And perhaps because of that, they almost perished. Can you talk about a little bit more about that?
So while there certainly wasn't entirely cohesive people, certainly the moment they were threatened, the Jews all fought together as a single entity. So as has happened many times in our history, sadly not every time, but many times in our history, when our people were threatened, they came together as one. And certainly by the end of the story, the people were united in admiration for Mordechai.
Seems that every time we are not in Achdut and together, something bad happens to us. If we are divided or with friction among us, something bad happens to us.
One of my favorite lessons from the Rebbe is his comparison of the generation from the flood to the generation of the Tower of Babel. The first time Babylon is mentioned in the Torah is when a tower is built there to fight God. The generation of the flood engaged in sinful relationships, and God killed them all. The generation of the tower engaged in war against God, and God only punished them, he didn't kill them. And the Rebbe explains that those who were engaging in sins were doing it separately. The nation that was fighting God was doing it together. And God so much enjoys unity among his children, even when they're committing the greatest sin of all, he doesn't kill them for it. So certainly I think you can see many times where disunity amongst the Jews caused the destruction of the temple. Certainly, and we can get into this in a longer form, both the temples were destroyed because of disunity among Jews in addition to idol worship. And as the song that we sang, that we heard in the beginning, it combined the two things. We want Mashiach and to love your fellow Jew, that Mashiach will only come when we all get along. Maybe Rabbi Hershkovich can sing it for us. But yes, certainly it is through disunity that we are harmed and through unity that we are spared.
Could I ask another question? Could you just go over, for some reason I never heard the story, about Mordechai perhaps being her husband and having a child. So is that, how did that come about?
So Esther was a young, beautiful, unmarried girl. The second that the king's guards told her to report to the castle, she thought, how can I get out of this arrangement? She thought perhaps if I was married, if I was no longer fit for the king, if the king wouldn't be the first person I had been with, then I would be spared from this indecency of having to become part of the king's harem. So she quickly got married. There's actually an argument among the rabbis who she married, but many believe the person she married was her cousin Mordecai. But either way, now Mordecai at this point would have been in his mid-80s. Whoever she married was severely older than her. It wasn't a marriage based off romance or any, I can let the love rabbi talk about all that. It was a marriage specifically to ensure her connection with her religion and her God. But many rabbis agree that her husband was Mordecai. Either way, the rabbis say that that marriage, as we said, illuminates her decision, willing to give up her chance at happiness. And the rabbis dispute whether the child that was born was either a child born of being forced by Achashverosh or through unity with her husband. Those, of course, are the only two options.
Hey, Fischel, thank you.
Okay.
I don't want to interrupt you. I know you have more questions. You have so many questions coming in. I have a very hard time interrupting Fischel since he's from our best and our brightest, and a Holocaust survivor and a chazan, and it's very hard for me to...
1 second, this is the chazan that you said I have to bring to speak at my university.
That's right. This is it.
So, Reb Fischel, you and I, we have to talk later.
Absolutely. Be a pleasure.
So, okay, so I have a bunch of questions coming in and a few people that want to unmute themselves. So let me just ask you, okay, first of all, the first question is, someone just, Maria, she didn't understand, was there 2 meals, 3 meals? Can you just clarify that? That should be an easy clarification.
Esther made 2 meals specifically for the king and Haman. The first one at the end of the 3 days was the night of the second Seder, and the second meal was the next night. So she made 2 meals. Both for her husband and Haman.
There's a couple of questions that have come in that are real pushback to the story. So if you're not able to answer them, that's fine. But I would really love to bring them up and to be able for you to be able to see if we can.
I'm from Kentucky, Cassius Clay. I can bob and weave.
So exactly. So the first question is. We pegged this tonight as a historic rendition of the story of Esther. And how is that an historic rendition can involve angels? Because you mentioned the angel Gabriel. How is that possible that we include angels in an historic rendition?
So it is not disputed in the historic rendition that Haman cast lots, but nobody was present when it happened. The only way we know the name of Purim, of lots, is because Mordecai had the ability of prophecy. He was able to see through the power of God what Haman was doing at that time. I think it is, to quote David Ben-Gurion Lahavdil, in order to be a realist in the land of Israel, one has to believe in miracles. I think in order to believe any part of Jewish history, in order to discuss any chapter of our history, you choose the decade, you choose the century, one has to rely on the overwhelming power of God. Otherwise, the story simply doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Sharon, I believe you wanted to unmute yourself. Would you like to?
Yes. I would like to know if you could elaborate on what you were saying about Haman's daughter. When he was leading the horse, what was over his head?
So
yes.
Haman had many sons. He only had 1 daughter. I had 3 daughters before I ever had a son, so I don't know what his psyche was like, but she had a special place in his heart. Haman's daughter was raised, much like her mother, to be viciously anti-Semitic and to express her feelings. When she saw the horse and rider come by her home, she figured that her father chose to humiliate Mordecai before he killed him. So she took the chamber pot from the bathroom. At that time in Persia, there was no plumbing. So there was a physical basin that was put in the bathroom for human refuse, and it'd be emptied by servants at the end of the day. So she took that bucket and poured it down on the man who was leading the horse, who was her father Haman.
Okay.
Do we know her name?
Do we have her name through history?
Do we know the name of this single daughter of Haman? I've never seen her name mentioned anywhere. Do we know it?
Yes, it is mentioned somewhere. I'd have to check my research. I don't know it offhand.
Okay, that would be interesting to know. Okay, so why aren't, this is another question that came in privately, why aren't all of these details mentioned in the Megillah? Some of them seem so essential to the actual story of the Megillah.
Right.
So, number one, specifically, the Megillah was written during the times of King Achashverosh. So any of the facts that would have bothered King Achashverosh were taken out. Number two, the Megillah was written specifically by Esther with the power of prophecy, that every word should be exactly as it should be to be one of the books, not only a book of history. There are many wonderful books of Jewish history, but a book of the Torah.
Right.
So Esther had divine intuition exactly what words to use to describe every single. I don't know if all of the dialogue is accurate even. Perhaps the dialogue has been changed to what the person felt rather than what the person said. But every word Esther wrote was with divine intuition. That is the word God wanted to be there. So for example, as we mentioned, Esther's dual prayer, which she's praying to both the king, God, and the king Achashverosh, the line where it says that the city of Shushan was up and the king was sleeping, the king was restless. It's referring both to God and to King Achashverosh. And there are several other points throughout the story where there is, the text is obviously written to mean many things.
That's very interesting. Are there other books from that time period that didn't make it into the holy books of the Tanakh? That is there another story like the book? I think the story of Hanukkah happens after the Tanakh period. So
Esther is the very last book that's included. Everything else is written beforehand.
Right. So it's a unique book on many levels because of that.
Correct. Now we do have books that happen after that, but they were written beforehand.
Are there any other books in the Tanakh that are written by a female? Devorah wrote something, right?
Devorah includes chapters that were written by Devorah. It is not known whether she wrote the entire book or not. Certainly the poetry chapters, the recap of the wars, are written by her hand.
So this is the only full book of the 24 books of Tanakh that is written by a woman?
That we know to have been written by a woman, yes.
Wow, it's amazing, amazing. And I do appreciate how in the story, the way you told it, I mean, you told it very true to the story as to kind of accentuate the fact that, you know, this is Esther's story, this is a female story.
Certainly.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important to point that out, and I'm happy that you did. There's another one that came in here, which is a very complicated one, but I would love to hear what your take on it. Was it not adultery until she went of her own volition? So what you're saying essentially is that she engaged in a huge sin in order to potentially save the Jews. May one engage in a huge sin to save the Jewish people?
So if we're getting to...
So actually, the question was clarified. Is it that may one engage in a sin for the greater potential good?
So if we are getting very specific into the law, it is not adultery according to Torah law for Esther to have slept with Achashverosh.
Because she never consummated the marriage with...
No, because Achashverosh wasn't a Jew. So the specific sin that's written in the Torah is for a Jewish woman to sleep with a Jewish man outside of her marriage.
Okay, that's very...
So you could say she was betraying her husband to the Jewish people, except for the fact that it was her husband who told her, according to most opinions, to go. but there was no sin involved there.
Wow.
Also, she wasn't going to, she didn't go and offer herself to the king. However, she was in any way, so again, it wasn't that Esther went before him, God forbid, in a lewd fashion as Vashti would have, but rather Esther just went in front of him. Esther in any way engaged in that relationship. So you certainly couldn't say it was adultery for a woman to talk to a man. Women talk to men all the time. They never spoke to me when I was younger, but the other men they speak to apparently. However, Esther for the very first time just speaks to Ahasuerus without needing to. So that's her first recognition that there is a relationship there. So she wasn't engaging in anything physical, God forbid, to save the Jewish people. But she was recognizing that a relationship exists between her and Ahasuerus. So I think for those two reasons, it's not a betrayal either of Jewish law or of her husband.
Wow. Wow, it's a fascinating answer. Does anyone else have a question? You can unmute yourself. You're welcome to write it in the chat box or to unmute yourself. I'm sure many questions came up throughout the story. We'd love to hear from you.
Rabbi Bernard, it's the Tosfos says that that he never. It wasn't her actually who went. It was a apparition in the form of Esther. That's one pshat in this. But technically, what our other rabbi said is correct. That it's not the woman who is not allowed. It's a motche. No, not that one. She never went willingly to the king. She only went when she was called. In other words, she was forced. Every time she went to him, she was forced. If you're forced, you're not mechiv. A woman is not mechiv to be moisanefish on this. Only a man on this avera. So she technically the only time she went willingly was when she went when she fasted 3 days and when she had to go and save Klal Yisrael. That was the only time she went willingly.
But again, even then, she didn't go to engage in any kind of physical act.
No, that's true too. But she was prepared for anything. She put on nice clothes. It says befeirish that she put on nice clothes and this.
Yeah. Rabbi Litvin, can you just kind of clarify Mr. Pollack's explanation for those who don't understand all of the details of the Tosfos?
So, whether or not there is one opinion that says that she sent a holy image in her place in the beginning. Its full understanding is a longer discussion that I can't explain in the short period I have to answer questions now. But either way, there's two things. As was mentioned, the Tosfos says, number one, she didn't go forward looking for physical action. She went forward in order to speak to the king. She was 100% prepared for whatever would happen, which is why she would then be forbidden to her husband. As Rabbi Shmuly mentioned in the chat, Noda B'Yehuda mentions that if you're saving the entire Jewish nation, the 3 rules you're not allowed to break to save your own life, which are forbidden relations, idol worship, and murder, you are allowed to do.
Wow.
But again, due to these two things, number one, the fact that she wasn't going to initiate anything physical, she was rather just recognizing the relationship existed. And number two, the fact that the person she was going to was not a Jew, was not someone she could legally marry according to Torah, it is not considered that she God forbid, performed adultery, but rather she recognized a relationship outside of her marriage, which according to Jewish law means she can no longer be with her husband. Jewish law is extremely strict on many of the rules between a husband and wife, as the love rabbi could, I'm sure, fully explain.
Oh, thank you. This is a fascinating conversation. I also want to add a couple of notes that you hadn't brought up. Achashverosh is a Hebrew word, and that means it means Achashverosh, right? Hollow in his head. Is it? I mean, his real name, his real Persian name was Xerxes. Is it popular knowledge that he was, I guess, hollow in his head? Is that the kind of person he was?
So The secular knowledge of this period is filled with holes, is very poorly recorded.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same king's names over and over again. Either there were about 25 kings in 10 years of the same name, or they don't know which king was which. It's worth noting that both Daryavishes, the third that we mentioned, the Daryavish, the father-in-law of Koresh, and Daryavish, the son, I'm sorry?
The two people who we call Darius, right?
Correct, who would be called Darius in history, are both sons of Achashverosh, are both sons of Xerxes, is the name that the secular history books use. So it makes it very confusing when you have multiple people who have the same exact name, Darius, the son of Xerxes, Xerxes, the father of Darius, which especially in Persian culture, as in Arab culture, it's often common to recognize people by their children as well. So when you have similar names coming up again and again, it makes history books hard. Excuse me, there is a 200-year period that the secular history has wrong that comes right after the Purim story.
And why do you think that they have that wrong? I'm just curious. And would people debate that it's wrong?
Historians would certainly debate it, but we have an unbroken history that explains where all those years are. So they put an extra 200-year gap there.
You're saying you went through the Jewish sources and you went through what would be called, I guess, the secular or universal sources. And
this is an open discussion that there's about a 250-year gap between Jewish sources and secular sources. And it happens during the Persian Empire.
Interesting. I also, going back to the Purim story, I had heard that in the process of Achashverosh making that feast or that number of feasts that he had made, that he bankrupted the country. I had heard, what I understood was that often there was obviously a lot of rules. You explained that there was a lot of rules in Persia, that most people would drink out of one, what was it called? When the communal golden cup?
Puska.
The puska. They would drink out of the puska, but Achashverosh changed that and gave everybody their own golden goblet, and that he bankrupted the country as a result of it. And that was part of the problem later on.
So Achashverosh, who again, as we mentioned, his key feature of his personality was his inferiority complex, thought you could buy friends, which is true, by the way. You can buy friends as long as you're paying. The issue is when you run out of money, the friends disappear too. And he didn't realize that. So he spent tremendous wealth buying loyalty, which ebbed away as the central wealth of the country depleted. So it's hard to say he bankrupted the country because he spent the money in the country. Many of his lords benefited from the party, but he personally bankrupted the throne, which was then made rich again after this death of 75,000 people and all their wealth being transferred back to the throne. And it was only once he had this personal wealth again that he felt comfortable, for example, raising taxes. He wasn't able to raise taxes to recoup the losses because he was afraid if he raised taxes, it'd be a rebellion. It was only once, it's interesting, you can only get rich once you're rich. He could only felt comfortable raising taxes once he was personally wealthy again.
Right. So we have a few more minutes with Rabbi Litvin. Anyone else want to ask a question? Now is your time, please.
It's a machlokes in the Gemara if Achashverosh was melech typish or if he was a clever person. It's a machlokes. But one thing is for sure that he was one of the 9 kings who ruled over the whole world, the whole developed world at that time. So for his eigene, there's a Yiddish thing, every shmoige fazich teuger. He was, for his, what he needed for his things, he did very well. And the whole machinations that went around here is you can see that he was not totally stupid. He like the rabbi says, he had his inferiority complex came because he was not originally from royal lineage. He killed the whole house of Vashti. There's a whole story. Vashti was a small child and she woke up in the middle of the night while the Persians were killing their whole family. And she ran quickly to the king. She thought it was the father and she started crying. And it was Koirish and he saved he promised her that he wouldn't kill her. So that's why he had this whole inferiority thing. But the Gemara says that he was a bigger Rusha than Haman. He hated the Jews even more than Haman.
Based on what Mr. Pollack is saying, I think it's a very important note. Did Achashverosh need Vashti to justify his throne? did Achashverosh use Vashti to justify?
So as we mentioned earlier, Rabbi Pollack wasn't there quite in the beginning. We actually discussed the story of Vashti and being found by Kairish for his son. He didn't need Vashti to justify his throne, rather to solidify his throne. As we mentioned, in the third year of his kingdom, he was happy for three reasons. The three minor reasons was his marriage to Vashti, which he felt solidified his throne, as he's now married to the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the completion of Shushan, and especially the throne of Solomon, that people would think he was sitting on Shlomo Melech's throne. And number three, the victory over Haidu, completing 127 countries under his leadership. It's worth noting, Rabbi Pollack, that Achashverosh inherited the vast majority of his kingdom, and he only completed the rule. Once Mordechai was his prime minister. So while he was a king over the entire world, it wasn't really by his accomplishment that he did it, as opposed to several other kings. So for example, Alexander is one of the 9 kings. He conquered the entire world himself, as opposed to Achashverosh, who inherited a vast majority of the world from his father.
Okay, I agree. Okay. So.
Kayla, yes, Achashverosh did use vessels from the Holy Temple during the 180-day party, as Vashti's father had during his party, during which he died.
And that was something that was shocking to people, because people knew about the vessels from the temple. Like, why? I mean, to us as students of the Torah, as Jews, it was shocking to us that they would be using, imagine, I don't know, like the Prime Minister of Canada getting up and having the garments of the high priest on. I mean, that would be shocking to me, but was it shocking to everyone?
So imagine a country that is so assured in its power that it not only robs other countries in the world, but then builds something, we'll call it a random name like the British Museum of History, and fills it with stolen treasure it took from other countries. Imagine the gall it would take for a country to do that, to fill an entire museum of stuff they stole from other countries. So there are countries that do that. England has that. America has that. I don't know if Canada has museums, I've never been. But there are countries that have stolen from other countries and put it in a museum proudly. It wasn't the fact that he had gold. People were aware of who the God of Israel was. Zeresh, one of the worst anti-Semites in the story, acknowledges the power of the God of the Jews. The advisors to Achashverosh, as the advisors to Koresh had, as the advisors to Belshazzar had recognized the God of the Jews. So the assurance that I'm willing to offend the God of the Jews by using the vessels of his temple was a power play for any king. It was both a power play for Belshazzar and for Achashverosh. I flip my nose at the God of Israel. I don't fear him. And if I don't fear God, you should fear me.
Right. I think that's very powerful. Wow. Wow. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left.
I can have one more. It says when Esther says Ish Tsar v'Oyev, it says in the Gemara that originally she pointed at Achashverosh. She meant her original meaning was to point at him, and the Malach Gabriel came and pushed away her hand, pointed toward Haman. But she knew also. She also had this, because she recognized that he was also a very big Jew hater.
We also have Zerushals around the world today, right?
Here in Untold. We don't have to go far.
Yes. Well, I think what's interesting is, and I think a lot of people are writing this in the chat and are saying this, is that we see so many similarities between our world today and this world. I mean, you can't help, what Elie Wiesel said, if you're not a student of history, you are doomed to repeat it. And so I think that it's something that really carries through. I mean, in this story, for sure, we see it so clearly. You can just tell the story and we can see all the similarities with what's going on in our world. And I think, it's not just by chance that this is a story that we celebrate. We celebrate it as a story of joy, as a time of our miracles, of our, it was not a hidden miracle, there's certain sense it was a hidden miracle, but also there was a real openness to that miracle, besides it's hidden in nature, which, there's many commentaries about that as well. something very powerful. Wow. Rabbi Litvin, do you want to finish off tonight?
Rabbi Menachem.
Yes.
If I could, I was, my brother, Rabbi Shlomo, did an incredible job. I came to listen. I was studying something about what you just said, that the Megillah story was the first time that the Jews had ever been threatened with annihilation. And it was a time when, in theory, they could have said, no, we're not Jewish, and just don't attack us, we'll stop. We'll go away. Our temple was destroyed, the 70 years didn't work, Daniel's calculations didn't work. Just they could have just said no, and they didn't. And they stood up and they took charge and said, we're willing to take Jews, and how they connected to what the commandments have been given by Sinai. But it was the first time that we took stock, and it's a reason why it matters so much versus all the other times that we've been annihilated and don't have crazy parties afterwards. And the neshama that comes out from this occurrence is what keeps us being able to be proud to be Jews when it makes no sense nowadays.
I think a lot of people ask this question as to like why the story of Passover, why the story of Purim, why are these the stories that we celebrate? And I think the only answer that we can give is because they're all firsts. Passover is the first time a nation enslaved another nation. And so we remember that. And that's why Martin Luther King, a black preacher in 1967 stood up and quoted the story of Passover, because every nation that's ever been enslaved has looked at our story and said, if they can be enslaved and freed in a single generation, so could we. And I think the same is with the story of Purim, that it's the first time, like you said, it's the first time that a nation that the Jewish people were at the verge of annihilation. And the Jewish people could have so easily just given in. And they didn't. Fishel, I know you have a lot to say.
I want to just go back to the Jewish people in the empire. Looking back at Esther, who Mordecai tells her to be quiet about it. But the other people that I presume, Jewish people didn't know that she is actually giving herself to Achashverosh. Okay, would that have caused some rift in the Jewish community, because they didn't know that she was doing it to save them? She was just chosen, and she went with him, probably to marry him or live with him or whatever. So how did that play against the community, the Jewish community at the time?
If I have learned one thing from watching modern politics, it's if it's someone you like, you can forgive anything. And if it's someone you don't like, everything you do is wrong. So those who supported what Esther was doing said, oh, she's doing it because she's our leader. She has to represent us. She's doing what she can. And those who didn't like her, whatever she did was wrong.
All right.
It's good. Rabbi Litvin, do you have any parting thoughts? And I'd like to, before we finish, I'd also like to talk.
So just there was two more comments at the end I want to address very quickly. The Ark of Titus in Rome was built 100 years after or more after the destruction of the temple. So while it does depict the temple menorah being carried back to Rome, it depicts the menorah incorrectly. It has the menorah rounded. It's the first image of a round menorah, which there's no basis for in Jewish history. The menorah was V'd, and they painted it wrong. Number two, someone asked, is Netanyahu the king of Israel? I would say he isn't, but I wouldn't tell him that to his face. I'm not going to be the one to tell him.
Any parting words?
I would only say that there are those who look at false signs again and again in this story and say the years are up, the Jews aren't returning, the years are up, the Jews aren't returning, the years are up, the Jews aren't returning. Those people still exist. Judaism is over, Judaism is over, Judaism is over. God has forgotten the Jews, etc., etc. But the lesson we should leave with is, number one, put the team on your back of Esther, that I'll do what's right. Aksher avadati avadati, whatever happens, happens. And the message to Jewish children that Al Tiro, there's nothing to fear. I think the ultimate message of Mordechai was not how he convinced the Jewish people, but rather that he stopped to listen to those children, to receive that message of Al Tiro. The only time that there's no fear for the Jewish people is when we listen to our children, we invest in Jewish education, and when we ensure that Judaism will continue.
Thank you, Rabbi Litvin. This has been an unbelievable pleasure to have you here tonight to share the story with us. As many people have said in the chat, that you're an amazing storyteller, captivating. You made it interesting for us, and we really appreciate it. And
Say something for the husband.
But you should know that it's a very big deal for us because we're all in curfew. Nobody can get out of their house right now. So the fact that you gave us something really good to do this evening is really appreciated more than you can imagine.
If anyone wants to lay down, I can continue with the story how my family came to America. Everyone can fall asleep to a nice story.
Some people are shaking their head. I will just before we finish for the evening, I would like to just talk about Purim. Purim is going to be this Thursday night and Friday. Now, I have some information that just finally we were able to. We've been working very, very hard. We know all the limitations, and as you know, as a community, we have taken always the highest level. We always speak to the highest common denominator in everything we do, whether it comes to Judaism, whether it comes to COVID, whatever it is. So we've had the shul closed for various reasons now, as you know. I just received just this evening an okay from the police department that will be able to have a number of Megillah readings. Now, the Megillah needs to be read in person in order to really fulfill the mitzvah. It has to be read in person. And so therefore, we're allowed 10 people, and there's going to be a sign-up sheet, and you can sign up if you want. We're going to have the place sanitized in between each Megillah reading. It's going to be very, very strictly done with people coming in. You're going to come in, you're going to have a place to sit. It's going to have your name on it. There's going to be a Megillah reader, everyone masked, everyone properly, everything properly taken care of as to the highest standard. So if somebody wants to be able to hear the Megillah in person, this should not be a hindrance to them. So you'll be able to sign up. I have a sign-up sheet. I'm going to send everybody an email, but if you want, I have a sign-up sheet here. Now, if somebody, for whatever reason, cannot leave their home, I have another option, and you can contact me privately, and I will make sure that you're taken care of so that you can get the best option possible. It's not the ideal, but the best option possible if you're really unable to leave your home. The morning, we'll have the same story. During the day, at night, and during the day, we're going to have both. We're allowed to read Megillah at 6 o'clock. So we're going to have four Megillah readings, 6, 6:30, 7 o'clock, and 7:30, in order to get people will be able to get home in time for the curfew. Now, the morning, we're also going to have a number of options. As far as the other response, there's 3 other mitzvahs that we do. That's going to be Friday day. The first mitzvah is to give 2 food items to one person. The minimum mitzvah is 2 ready-made food items to one person. If you don't have any way of doing it, we have ready-made boxes that we can bring you, and we can have somebody bring it to you, and then you can say, please be my messenger to give it to someone else, and we'll take care of that for you. The second thing is we're supposed to give enough money to 2 poor people, enough for 1 meal, each of them, which essentially is about $5. So the minimum would be $10, just 2 times $5. People give more. It's totally your choice. But I'm just talking about the minimum. I have now a list of 8 people that are in our community who we can say with certain we've checked them, and they are people who need what's called matanat levyonim. They are truly poor and need this money. So I will be going around on Purim on behalf of the community and giving out this money. Anybody that wants to designate me as their messenger, I will make sure to get that done for you. And so you can just make sure that you take care of that and designate me before the holiday so I can get it, because I'm going to be doing that on the holiday. And the third is, someone said $5 for a kosher meal. Okay, yes, good question. But this is the minimum, You can go more, but this is the minimum. And then the third is having a festive meal. So you can have the festive meal anytime during the day. You're supposed to wash for hamotzi and have a motzi and have the festive meal. What a lot of people will be doing, because it's a Friday, is we wash for hamotzi in the afternoon before Shabbat. And then you're going to stop your meal and light the Shabbat candles and make Kiddush, and then you can continue your meal. So that's because of the unique celebration of having Purim on Friday this year. So once again, we hear the Megillah twice. We do the Shalach Manot, having the food basket to one person, which you can designate us, and we give 2 poor people. You can also designate us, and then the festive meal, you're on your own for that. But I assume that you have what to eat. And if you don't have what to eat, we'll arrange that too for you with pleasure. So that is the story for Purim. I will be sending out an email to everyone, so you'll have all this information and all the links that you will need. There's also a link here of a little campaign. It's not fully finished, but this is a campaign that you can use in order to be able to get the money, or you can just go online. You can also use it online and just make sure that we know that it's for, why is this not linking up? Okay. Oh, I see why. Okay, I'm just doing this, sorry. Just make sure that we know that it's for the poor for Purim. Just make sure that, so we can designate it properly. Oops, nope, that didn't work. Let's try it again. Did that work? Didn't work, okay. In any case, that is the story. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we're going to be having a number of other really great Purim events. For the one that if you don't know about it, Saturday night, which is going to be Shushan Purim, we are doing a live murder mystery called Megillat Murder Mystery. It's going to be a live murder mystery that takes place after the story of Purim. It's going to be with live actors on Zoom. It's going to be a really fun evening, which is going to happen 8 o'clock this coming Saturday night after Purim as a nice community event. So we hope to see you there. Once again, thank you, Rabbi Litvin. This has been an unbelievable pleasure. And hopefully we'll see you again for another great piece of history, a nice historical lesson. So thank you. And on behalf of everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Seriously, and burn through my gear.
And what's this?
Hey, have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable.
I'm happy that you enjoyed it, Sharon.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We should play.
Where is this congregation?
This is in Montreal.
In Montreal.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Thank you, Robbie.
You're well. Thank you for joining us, Janet.
Thank you.
Where are you, Janet?
I'm 38 miles northwest of Boston.
Oh wow, amazing.
And I've been looking for a rabbi to talk to, actually.
So
my spiritual journey has been very interesting in the last few years.
Janet, if you wouldn't mind, send me an email. My dad's originally from Boston. I know many rabbis in the area. I'd be happy to help out.
I'm not mobile. That's a long story.
I might know a rabbi who can come visit you, or at least, and if you need to speak to a rabbi, you can speak to me on the phone. Or if you're interested, I'd be happy to discuss with you.
It's a wild story, trust me. I mean, really wild.
We can set up a Zoom meeting with pleasure.
Thank you. How do I do that?
I have your email, right? Because I have your email from tonight, or no?
So it'll say JB1Earth or JB for one for all @gmail.com.
Let me just make sure.
Would your emails